Could you share a personal crisis of your own, please, and what lessons you learned from it?
Sure, the most acute personal crisis of my professional life came when I was a first-year graduate student at age 21, and it nearly sent me out of science and academic life. I was a graduate student in physiology, laboratory physiology at Cambridge, England, after having been very successful in high school and college, so I was used to succeeding. And my experiments were not working. My advisor was a great physiologist who was very good with his hands. I was not good with my hands. And in the course of a couple of months, I was doubting whether I would succeed in physiology and whether I wanted to be a physiologist or a scientist at all. And it coincided with my rereading Thoreau's Walden, of which the message is, do what you care about and never mind what other people think. But for scientists, it's important what other people think, whether they think you're a great scientist. And so I was seriously considering dropping out of science and becoming a simultaneous translator. I was going to go to Switzerland and enroll in translator school and work for the UN, which would have meant a much more precarious living, but at least I would love languages. And I was thrashing back and forth. Fortunately, my parents came through Europe at the time. We talked about it for days, must have been horrible for them. And finally, my father resolved it for me by saying, perhaps it's too early to pull the plug on what had been your life. Go after a few months, why not try another semester? And you can always go to translator school if it doesn't work in that semester. So I tried another semester and the experiments began to work. I forgot about Thoreau's philosophical doubts about the scientific career, but it nearly sent me out of science, and it illustrates personal crises in many ways.
And what did you learn that
what did I
might
learn?
be applicable to your latest book, Upheaval?
Many things. It was my first severe professional crisis, and young people, teenagers and people in their 20s like me then, your first crisis is most severe because you don't have experience of having overcome previous crises. I've had subsequent professional crises, but I thought back to my first one, and I remembered I got through that, so probably I'll get through this. That's one thing. Another lesson was to appraise myself honestly. At that time, I was not honest in appraising my linguistic abilities. I loved languages, but I was not Swiss. I hadn't begun speaking other languages at the age of 4. Didn't start until I was 12. So I still have an accent today in my best languages. I was being dishonest if I thought that I could succeed as a linguist, but I was also being unfair on myself in thinking that I could not succeed as a scientist, not being good with my hands, because there are plenty of scientific experiments that you can carry out with really simple equipment. So those were a couple of things I learned from that first crisis.
I think in your book you describe a crisis. One of the characteristics of a crisis is not having a previous experience with previous experience or modeling.
That's true. So for personal crises like that one, if you succeed in dealing with a previous crisis, that gives you confidence. But another thing is being able to use other people as models. If there's someone else that you can look to who has dealt with a similar crisis and overcome it, that gives one ideas, confidence, and possible models for how to succeed. But the Cambridge Department of Physiology, I was the only graduate student that year. There was nobody with whom I could share my floundering around. So that was another thing that made it difficult and painful.
Let's examine Chile, one of the nations you've studied. It had a thriving historic democracy and unexpectedly flipped into a dictatorship. You ask, could it happen in the U.S.? What did happen in Chile?
What did happen in Chile was the Latin American country with the longest history of democracy, century and a half, spiraling into a military dictatorship unforeseen by my Chilean friends. I moved to Chile in 1967, and my Chilean friends explained their country to the visiting American by saying, we're not like those other Latin American countries. We are democracy. We know how to govern ourselves. That was their expression. We know how to govern ourselves. My Chilean friends didn't foresee what was coming up in 6 years, but Chile was drifting into a breakdown of political compromise. Psst, Americans, what do you think about breakdown of political compromise? And in Chile, breakdown of political compromise led to a military coup in 1973. The Chileans expected the military government to stay in office just a couple of months and go back to democracy. But instead, the military government stayed in power for 17 years, smashed world records for sadism and torture.
How could the Chile scenario play out in the U.S.? You've said you don't expect a coup by our military, which hasn't been involved in our politics in America. So how might a threat of authoritarianism play out in the U.S.?
Authoritarianism might play out in the U.S. in the way that it's starting to play out now. There are other ways to end democracy than by a military coup. You can end democracy by progressively making it harder and harder for citizens to register to vote. Think about the United States. You can end a democracy by the government decreasing its investment in its citizens so that 10% of the citizens get a good education and job training and 90% don't. That means the effect of undermining of a democracy even without a military coup. For example, in the state of either Alabama or Mississippi, to vote in Alabama or Mississippi, you have to show a driver's license. Well, plenty of African Americans don't have driver's licenses, and the state of Alabama, in its wisdom, decided, because the state is controlled by the party opposite to the party that African Americans are likely to vote. The state of Alabama decided to close down Department of Motor Vehicle offices in those counties with African American majorities, making it impossible for African Americans to get driver's licenses. Naturally, that provoked a lawsuit, so the state of Alabama backtracked. And yes, it opened DMV offices in those counties one day a month on Wednesday when people are working, all of which is an example of how a local or state government in the United States can make it difficult for citizens likely to choose the other vote. And that's one example, Alabama, but there are so many other ways that it happens, by gerrymandering and by, for example, in the most recent election for governor of Georgia. Who do you imagine was the chief state electoral official for the government for the state of Georgia? It was the candidate for the governor of Georgia.
I was struck in your book by examples of other countries like Italy, for example, and Germany, where it's so much easier to vote, and you get percentages like 80%, 90% of the people voting higher.
Yeah. Italy, every election in Italy, since Italy became a republic in 1948, every parliamentary election and every referendum has had a turnout between 85 and 93%. There is no election in modern American history with a turnout of 85%. The highest turnout that we've had for a presidential election, which is what gets the highest turnout, there was 61% turnout in 2008. The most recent election for mayor of my city of Los Angeles, which after all is one of the most important American cities, and the mayor of LA is one of the most important elected officials in US city government. The turnout for mayor of LA was 20%. Well, if we Americans complain about our government, we're getting the bad government that we deserve. We can't, even if you succeed in registering to vote, so many Americans don't bother to vote.
Why do you say that the unwillingness to compromise is the greatest threat to the United States?
Well, there are other major threats to the United States, and you can argue about whether unwillingness to compromise is a worse threat than is socioeconomic inequality or socioeconomic loss of mobility or the decline of government investment in public goods. All four of those are bad. But to me, the thing that may lead in the quickest straight line to the end of democracy is preventing people from voting, because democracy is defined as the form of government in which decisions depend ultimately on voters, on potential, on citizens voting. And if citizens, in fact, can't vote, then it may be a democracy in name, just as the Democratic Republic of North Korea is a democracy in name.
You also cite one of our problems in the U.S. is lack of public investment compared to other countries. I thought your example of Finland and their approach to education was inspiring. Could you share that, please?
Sure, we can talk about education in Finland or in South Korea or in Japan. In Finland, if you look at educational outcomes, if you look at which countries around the world have their students with the highest academic performance, the 6 highest countries, 5 of them are Asian, and the only non-Asian country in the top 6 around the world is Finland. Why in Finland? Well, Finland is a small country of 6 million. With only 6 million citizens, you can't throw away 90% of your citizens. You need to get the best out of all of them. And so in Finland, the top students in university go into teaching. In my 53 years of teaching at the University of California, I have had 2 students who went into teaching in my entire 53 years. But in Finland, the top students go into teaching, and school teachers have higher incomes, and they enjoy higher prestige than do university professors. Similarly, in South Korea, you got to be right at the top of your class if you want a job as a teacher. In the United States, you got to be right at the bottom of your class if you want a job. That's exaggerated and too cruel, but the best students in the best American universities do not go into teaching.
Your book is about nations facing crisis. However, the entire world faces several crises. Let's take the climate crisis, for example. What models in your study might translate towards solving the climate crisis?
Well, when you ask what models can the world look to towards solving the climate crisis, one's first reaction, and certainly my first reaction in writing that chapter in the book, was there is no model. The world does not have a successful track record of solving world crises. Yes, we had the League of Nations, and now we have the United Nations, but the United Nations is not a powerful governmental entity as are national governments. But the fact is, fortunately, I learned better before I finished that chapter in my book. In fact, the world has solved really difficult problems in the last 50 years, such as eradicating smallpox, which meant getting every person exposed to smallpox, eliminating smallpox in every country, including Somalia, where there was the last case. What could be more difficult than tracking down the last case of smallpox in Somalia? Greatly reduce the risk of oil spillage, or the delineation of overlapping coastal economic zones. God, anything as difficult as that. All the countries around the coast, and so many of them have overlapping zones, to get every one of them to agree on delineating their coastal zones, but we did it. And more recently, the Seabed Convention that makes it possible to exploit relatively pure mineral nodules on the seafloor. All of the landlocked countries, Bolivia and Laos and Mongolia, naturally did not want an agreement in which all the money would go to coastal countries. And there were some difficult negotiations, but it ended up that Mongolia and Laos and Bolivia and other landlocked, and Zambia, get 15% of the profits from seabed mining. It was a difficult negotiation. Since we manage those things, I think we can manage climate change and the nuclear risk and non-sustainable resource use and inequality, I hope.
You told New York Magazine there's a 49% chance the world as we know it will collapse by about 2050. I was really depressed when I read that. Do you consider 50-50, or I should say 51-49, pessimistic or optimistic?
51% cautiously optimistic. Don't be shocked when I say that the chances are close to balance that the world as we know it, first world living standards, may come to an end within the next few decades. That's not a revelation by me. Anybody who thinks of climate change and non-sustainable resource use and then thinks of the nuclear risk India and Pakistan and North Korea and the United States. Of course, we face big problems and the risk, it's touch and go whether we will come out okay. But I'm cautiously optimistic. I would say the chances are at least 51% that will come out on the right side, because in addition to all the bad news, there's progress. 5 years ago, the majority of Americans didn't believe in the reality of climate change. Now the majority of Americans, although not our brilliant legislators, the majority of Americans believe in the reality of climate change and believe that it's caused by humans. That's real progress.
You're deeply involved in studying these enormous problems. How do you maintain your emotional perspective?
The way I maintain a way that I maintain my emotional perspective is by reading the newspaper in the morning and then not turning on the radio or television, which would just upset me. I'm willing to be upset in the morning before 8 a.m. and then I can forget about it for the rest of the day. That I recommend to people who do not own stocks in television and radio companies if you want to maintain your calm.
One last question. As you wrote this book, what new things did you learn about human nature?
What new things did I learn about human nature? A quick answer would be, I didn't learn anything new about human nature, because I've always known that people are complicated. They're mixtures of good and bad. All of us get into crises. Most of us get through them, but some people don't. The main thing that I learned is that the outcome predictors for personal crises suggest outcome predictors for national crises. People do or don't get help from friends. Nations do or do not get help from allies. People accept responsibility. People get through a crisis. They're more likely to get through a crisis if they accept responsibility and don't blame it on others. Well, do you know any country whose leader today blames it on Canada, Mexico, and China for our problems and doesn't acknowledge that we Americans are the only people who can end democracy in the United States? That's the main thing that I learned from the book.